Why "blessed are the pure in heart" is more radical than you realize. There are spiritual statements that soothe, and there are spiritual statements that unsettle. Some lull the heart with poetry, and others pierce it with truth. But there are also sayings that are so gently spoken that their revolutionary force is almost entirely missed. "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God" is one of these deceptively soft teachings, a line so graceful that its radical nature often goes unnoticed. We hear it quoted in sermons, printed on wall decor, whispered as comfort, or spoken as moral encouragement. But rarely do we stop to consider what this phrase actually meant in its original context, or what it demands of us today. Beneath its sweetness lies one of the most subversive truths Jesus ever uttered. The Beatitude does not speak of moral perfection, ceremonial purity, or religious accomplishment. It is not about outward righteousness or avoiding wrongdoing. Instead, it targets the inner world, the place where true spiritual life begins or ends. And by doing so, it dismantles the religious and cultural structures that depend on external performance to define holiness. In the world of first-century Judea, purity was a public, institutionalized system. It determined who was allowed into the temple, who was considered spiritually legitimate, and who was excluded. Purity was controlled by the elite, monitored, measured, and enforced. It was a hierarchy of holiness. Those pure held privilege, those impure carried shame. Into this world Jesus speaks, "Blessed are the pure in heart," not the pure in ritual, not the pure in status, not the pure in appearance, not the ones approved by religious systems, but the pure within those whose hearts are aligned with truth, sincerity, and integrity. With that single sentence, Jesus bypassed the priests, overturned the purity hierarchy, and declared that access to God is not mediated by institutions or rituals, but by the condition of one's inner life. This beatitude is not gentle, it is revolutionary. It tells us that the deepest spiritual authority comes not from outward compliance, but from inward clarity. It asserts that divine presence belongs to those who have nothing to hide, nothing to prove, and nothing to protect. It is a direct confrontation of hypocrisy, ego, and religious performance. It is an invitation to radical authenticity, the kind that dismantles illusions and transforms perception, and it promises something astonishing. The pure in heart shall see God, not merely believe in God, not only seek God, not simply obey God, but see God. This is not a future tense reward. It is the natural consequence of a heart made clear. When inner fog lifts, the divine becomes visible not as an object, but as the truth illuminated through every moment, every person, and every breath. To fully understand why this teaching is more radical than anyone realizes, we must examine what pure in heart meant to its original audience, why it threatened the structures of its time, and how it calls us today to an inner revolution far deeper than morality. The meaning of a pure heart. To truly grasp the power of this beatitude, we must first understand what pure in heart meant to ancient listeners. In modern times, purity is often associated with innocence, moral perfection, or a kind of spiritual cleanliness. But in the Hebrew worldview, purity was about wholeness rather than flawlessness. The heart was not a symbol of emotion, it was the center of the self. It was the locus of desire, thought, will, intention, and identity. To be pure in heart, then, meant to be undivided, unified in purpose, honest in motive, and sincere in being. A pure heart was a heart without duplicity, a heart that did not wear masks, pretend to be righteous, or hide behind religious performance. It was a heart that sought truth over image, authenticity over approval, integrity over impression. Purity was not about avoiding mistakes, it was about avoiding self-deception. This distinction is profound. Many people avoid wrongdoing but still live fragmented, defensive, and dishonest inner lives. They present one identity in public but harbor another in private. They cling to ego, suppress their insecurities, or act from hidden motives they themselves barely acknowledge. In ancient terms, such a person was impure, not because they sinned, but because they were divided. A pure heart was a courageous heart, one capable of examining its motives without flinching. One willing to confront its shadows, question its intentions, and choose truth even when truth is uncomfortable. Purity is the condition of inner wholeness that allows a person to see clearly. It is the opposite of hypocrisy, the great enemy in Jesus' teachings. Hypocrisy created an outer shell of holiness while leaving the heart untouched. Jesus consistently confronted this, insisting that spiritual life is not measured by ritual compliance, but by the alignment between inner reality and outer living. Purity means living from the inside out, letting the truth of the heart shape behavior, instead of using behavior to mask the heart. This alone is revolutionary. Because in a world obsessed with appearances, a pure heart is an act of rebellion. In a society structured around external markers of holiness, Jesus redirects the entire conversation inward. The foundation of spiritual life becomes sincerity, the kind that no institution can measure or control. A pure heart cannot be faked. It must be formed through honesty, humility, and a willingness to surrender the ego's need for validation, formed through the continual integration of desire, conscience, and truth. And this kind of purity leads to something extraordinary. They shall see God. This promise, shocking in its simplicity, upends everything the ancient world believed about divine access. In the temple system, only a high priest could enter the Holy of Holies, and only once a year. Now Jesus says, anyone with an undivided heart, anyone who lives in truth, anyone who aligns inwardly with sincerity, that person will see God. Not the wealthy, not the elite, not the privileged, not the ritually perfect, but those who are inwardly clear. With this, Jesus declares a spiritual revolution. God is found not by climbing a hierarchy, but by descending into one's own heart. Why this teaching was radical in the ancient world. To modern ears, blessed are the pure in heart, sounds like a gentle moral encouragement. But to the people who first heard it, the statement was explosive. In the culture of first-century Judea, purity was not merely a personal ideal, it was a system of social order, religious power, and political control. Life revolved around purity laws. They governed what people ate, touched, wore, and where they could worship. Purity determined whether someone belonged or was excluded. Ritual purity was expensive, time-consuming, and often impossible for the poor, the sick, the disabled, or those considered unclean. It was a structure that protected the privileged and burdened the vulnerable. Only a select few, the priestly class, could claim full purity. They performed rituals, controlled temple access, and functioned as guardians of divine presence. The temple was the center of Jewish life, and purity was the gate that determined who could approach God. To be pure in ritual was to be socially honored. To be impure was to be spiritually suspect, morally inferior, and socially marginalized. Into this world Jesus speaks. Purity is not external. It is internal. With those words, he strikes directly at the foundation of the entire purity system. He takes purity out of the hands of institutions and places it inside the human heart, where no elite can regulate it, no ritual can manufacture it, and no priest can deny it. This was radical for several reasons. 1. It collapsed the hierarchy of holiness. The priests no longer had exclusive access to God. Ordinary people, fishermen, widows, shepherds, foreigners, suddenly became capable of standing on equal spiritual ground. 2. It exposed the hypocrisy of religious performance. Jesus repeatedly criticized leaders who followed external purity regulations while harboring jealousy, greed, pride, or cruelty. His teaching revealed that outward rituals meant nothing if the heart remained untouched. 3. It declared that divine encounter is personal, not institutional. Seeing God was not dependent on temple rituals, sacrifices, or elite mediation. It was available to anyone with sincerity. 4. It threatened political order. Rome maintained control partly by controlling religious structures. Any teaching that redistributed spiritual authority was inherently destabilizing. In essence, Jesus took the most guarded, most regulated, most hierarchical aspect of Jewish religion, purity, and democratized it with one sentence. He gave every person, regardless of social standing, a direct path to God. This undercut the economic, social, and religious power of the elite. It lifted the marginalized and lowered the exalted. It declared that God's attention is not bought with wealth or earned through performance, but recognized in the heart that stands unmasked before truth. For this reason, the Beatitude was not merely inspiring, it was revolutionary. It dismantled the external purity economy of the day and replaced it with a spiritual call to inner integrity. It challenged every structure built on appearances and placed the focus on authenticity. In the ancient world, this teaching was not soft poetry, it was a spiritual uprising. Purity as courage, not perfection. When people hear the word pure, they often think of moral flawlessness, an impossible standard, a kind of stainless spiritual perfection. But Jesus was not speaking about perfection at all. Purity of heart is not the absence of mistakes. It is the absence of duplicity. It is a state of inner alignment where intentions, values, and actions move in the same direction. Purity requires courage, not innocence. It takes bravery to examine one's own motives honestly. It takes courage to meet one's own weaknesses without denial. It takes strength to acknowledge ego, envy, fear, pride, or resentment without letting them define you. Pure-hearted people are not those who avoid the messiness of life. They are those who refuse to hide from the inner truth of who they are. Perfection is brittle. Purity is resilient. Perfection avoids failure. Purity is unafraid of it. Perfection hides flaws. Purity faces them. Perfection demands image. Purity demands honesty. A pure heart is a heart that refuses to pretend. It refuses to speak one way while thinking another. It refuses to pursue good deeds for hidden motives. It refuses to create an outer image that contradicts the inner reality. It seeks harmony between what it does and what it believes. This kind of purity cannot be taught through rules. It cannot be measured through rituals. It cannot be displayed for applause. It grows quietly in the soil of humility, shaped by the willingness to confront the self. This is why Jesus spoke so passionately against hypocrisy. Hypocrisy is not simply being two-faced. It is living from a divided heart, where identity fragments into pieces, one part for public display, another hidden in private, and still another known only to the ego. Fragmentation creates weakness. It forces a person to manage impressions rather than pursue truth. A pure heart is whole. A hypocritical heart is split. Inner division drains energy. It clouds perception. It fractures identity. Eventually, the divided heart cannot tell who it really is anymore. But purity brings a powerful freedom. When your inner world is unified, you no longer need to defend, hide, or posture. You do not fear being known. You do not live exhausted by your own contradictions. You are not controlled by the need to impress. You live from truth rather than performance. Purity is the courage to be inwardly transparent, even when that transparency exposes your weaknesses. It is the courage to drop the masks everyone else wears. It is the courage to let your life be shaped from within rather than directed by external pressure. This internal courage is the very thing that allows a person to see clearly. When the heart is undivided, perception sharpens. When motives are clean, the fog lifts. When the ego quiets, a deeper awareness emerges. Purity grants vision, and vision is the beginning of seeing God. This is why purity is not perfection, it is alignment. It is integrity at the deepest level of the soul. It is the brave commitment to truth when illusion would be easier. And it is the foundation of all spiritual clarity, the psychology of a pure heart. Modern psychology affirms what ancient spiritual wisdom has said for centuries. A divided inner life creates confusion, anxiety, and emotional turmoil, while an integrated inner life produces clarity, peace, and heightened perception. The pure heart, as Jesus described it, is not a mystical abstraction. It is a psychologically coherent state of being. A pure heart is a unified heart, a heart aligned with its values, desires, and truth. A heart not torn by hidden motives or inner contradictions. Psychologists call this congruence the alignment between one's inner world and outward behavior. People who are congruent experience less internal conflict because they are not living in tension between who they are and who they pretend to be. Their identities are not split into curated fragments. They do not expend endless emotional energy managing impressions or sustaining facades. A divided heart, on the other hand, is weighed down by duplicity. It must constantly shift between roles, protect its ego, conceal its wounds, and perform for approval. This inner fragmentation blurs perception. It prevents a person from seeing their own motives clearly, which in turn distorts how they perceive the world. Self-deception becomes a barrier to truth. Resentment becomes a lens through which everything is interpreted. Fear becomes a filter that shapes perception rather than reality. In psychological terms, impurity of heart is not sin, it is distortion. The pure heart, unified and honest, sees reality more accurately because it has stopped lying to itself. It no longer projects hidden fears onto others. It no longer interprets situations through unhealed wounds. It no longer confuses ego's voice with truth. This creates what psychologists describe as emotional clarity, which is the foundation of wisdom, empathy, and sound judgment. Purity also enhances emotional presence. When a person is not consumed by inner conflict, they can fully engage with others. Their attention is not divided. Their listening is deeper. Their compassion is not strained by insecurities. Such people often appear grounded, calm, perceptive, because they are not fighting private battles behind their eyes. Their inner world is peaceful enough for genuine presence to emerge. This clarity extends into intuition. Many people do not lack intuition, they lack the quietness to hear it. The pure heart, free from ego noise and emotional residue, becomes sensitive to subtle internal signals. Discernment strengthens, insight sharpens. Life becomes easier to navigate because the compass of the heart points steadily toward truth. The pure heart also experiences greater relational intimacy. Without masks or hidden agendas, relationships deepen naturally. Trust grows, vulnerability becomes possible, love becomes less conditional, less defensive, more generous. A unified heart can give and receive love without distortion. Finally, purity reduces fear. Fear thrives in hidden places, in secrets, lies, and contradictions. But when a heart becomes unified, there is less to fear. There is nothing to hide, nothing to defend, nothing to lose. This freedom brings courage, openness, and an ability to live fully in the present moment. Purity, in psychological terms, is inner integration, and integration is the foundation of clarity. And clarity is the foundation of seeing God, how impurity really works, the divided heart. If purity of heart is inner unity, then impurity is not a matter of moral stains or broken rules. Impurity is inner division. It is the fractured heart, fragmented by contradictions, shadowed by unacknowledged motives, tangled in self-deception. Impurity is the state of being inwardly split, unable to stand fully in truth because different parts of the self are at war with one another. Modern spirituality and psychology agree on this. Impurity is not about being bad. Impurity is about being inconsistent with oneself. Impurity as inner fragmentation. Impurity arises when you say what you don't truly mean. You act against your own values. You hide behind a curated version of yourself. You desire things you cannot admit. You cling to resentments. You refuse to confront. You suppress truth to maintain a false identity. These fractures divide the mind and heart. The person becomes two people or several, one for public view, one for private thoughts, one buried beneath it all, trying to be heard. This fragmentation causes the emotional exhaustion that so many people feel yet cannot name. Living a divided life drains energy the way a leak drains water from a vessel. No ritual or external performance can compensate for a heart at war with itself. Impurity as ego's defense mechanism. Impurity grows out of fear, the fear of being exposed, rejected, or insignificant. Ego attempts to protect itself by creating layers of denial, rationalization, projection, perfectionism, image management. But these defenses create more fragmentation, not less. Every act of self-protection bends the heart away from truth and deepens the divide. The more a person hides from themselves, the more they lose the ability to see clearly. Ego's constant scrambling keeps a fog over the inner world. A fogged heart cannot perceive what is real. Impurity as emotional buildup. Impurity also takes the form of unprocessed emotions. Unacknowledged grief, simmering resentment, quiet envy, long-held bitterness, guilt buried under activity, shame masked as pride. Each of these unintegrated emotions creates another fracture. They distort perception, making it difficult to see people, events, or oneself as they truly are. An impure heart doesn't lack intelligence, it lacks clarity. Impurity makes presence impossible. A person with a divided heart cannot fully inhabit the present moment. Their mind is busy maintaining the facade, avoiding certain truths, and suppressing unresolved emotions. They are half in the past, half in fear of the future, rarely fully here. Presence is purity, distraction is impurity. A pure heart can live in the now because it is not burdened by hidden contradictions. An impure heart is constantly pulled away from the present moment by the weight of what it refuses to confront. The real danger of impurity. The danger is not that God rejects the impure heart. The danger is that the impure heart cannot see clearly enough to recognize God anywhere. Impurity fogs perception. It makes a person misinterpret love, mistrust kindness, misunderstand truth, and misread reality. It causes a person to see threats where there are none, flaws where there is beauty, and distance where there is presence. Impurity blinds, purity reveals. This is why Jesus warns about impurity not to condemn, but to liberate. He invites the divided heart into wholeness so it can see clearly again. And clarity is the doorway to seeing God. They shall see God the most. Radical promise. Every beatitude contains a blessing, but this one contains something more, an astonishing, almost unbelievable promise. They shall see God. To the ears of Jesus's original listeners, this was not poetic language. It was a spiritual earthquake. In ancient Judaism, seeing God was the highest, holiest, and most impossible of human desires. The scriptures say that even Moses, the greatest prophet, was told, "No one may see me and live." Divine presence was veiled behind ritual, smoke, curtains, and sacred distance. Only the high priest, once a year, after elaborate purification, could enter the Holy of Holies, where God's presence dwelled. And now Jesus says something unthinkable. Not the priests, not the religious elite, not the outwardly righteous, not the ritually perfect, but the pure in heart, they shall see God. This was a complete redefinition of how divine encounter works. Jesus moved God from behind the veil to within the human heart. He declared that God is not found through hierarchy, but through authenticity, not through ritual, but through clarity, not through purity laws, but through purity of intention. This promise is not merely about heaven, it is about perception. Seeing God as seeing reality clearly, to see God is to see the world with a clarity no longer distorted by ego, fear, or fragmentation. Purity of heart sharpens perception. It reveals the sacred woven through the fabric of everyday life. In acts of compassion, in moments of silence, in the beauty of nature, in the dignity of another person, in the unfolding of one's own story. A pure heart perceives God, not as a distant deity, but as the truth beneath all things. The divine is not hidden, the heart is. Remove the fog from the heart, and the world glows with presence. Seeing God as inner illumination, spiritual traditions across cultures echo the same truth. When a person's heart is cleared of illusions, they perceive life through a dimension of awareness. It feels like seeing with different eyes, eyes that recognize interconnectedness, meaning, beauty, and divine imprint. This is why Jesus connects purity with vision. A distorted heart produces distorted perception. A unified heart produces spiritual clarity. Seeing God in others, the pure in heart see God in human beings, even those who are difficult to love. They recognize the divine image that hardship, ego, or brokenness may have obscured. Their vision cuts through behavior and sees essence. They understand others because they understand themselves. A pure heart sees through fear to compassion, through conflict to commonality, through wounds to worth. Seeing God in the present moment. To see God is also to be fully awake to the sacredness of now. Impurity pulls the mind into regret or anxiety. Purity anchors it in presence. Presence reveals God in ordinary life, in breath, conversation, silence, and awareness. Divine presence becomes undeniable to those whose hearts are clear enough to perceive it. The radical nature of the promise, Jesus' words announce a spiritual revolution. God is no longer distant, hidden, or reserved for an elite few. God is seen by those whose hearts have become simple enough, honest enough, unified enough to perceive the divine in everything. This is not a future reward. This is a present transformation. Purity clears the eyes, and when the eyes clear, God is everywhere. The invitation to inner revolution, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God," is more than a beautiful promise. It is a summons, a quiet but earth-shaking invitation into an entirely different way of being. At its core, this beatitude is not about achieving moral perfection, performing religious rituals, or upholding spiritual appearances. It is about something far braver and far more transformative, the courage to become inwardly whole. Purity of heart is not the absence of mistakes. It is the absence of masks. It is not flawless morality. It is flawless honesty. It is not external compliance. It is internal clarity. It calls us to drop the roles we perform for acceptance, the personas we craft for approval, the illusions we maintain out of fear. It challenges us to confront the contradictions within ourselves, the divided motives, the hidden wounds, the secret resentments, and to bring all of it into the healing light of truth. A pure heart is a heart willing to be known, both by God and by itself. This is the radical invitation of Jesus, to stop living split between inner truth and outer image, and to return to the unity for which we were created. For when the heart becomes whole, perception becomes whole. And when perception becomes whole, God becomes visible not as an object to be found, but as a presence to be recognized. Everywhere, in everything, in everyone. This is the hidden revolution behind the Beatitude. It shifts the center of spiritual authority from institutions to individuals. It elevates sincerity above status, integrity above ritual, truth above tradition. It democratizes access to the divine not through a priest, not through a temple, not through a system, but through the clarity of the heart. And this remains just as disruptive today as it was 2,000 years ago, because the modern world is noisy, fragmented, and performative. We are taught to curate our identities, to project certainty, to hide our flaws, to compete for significance. In such a world, purity of heart is an act of rebellion. It is the refusal to participate in the theater of image. It is the choice to stand in authenticity even when vulnerability feels risky. The pure in heart see God because they no longer see through the filters of fear, ego, comparison, or illusion. Their perception becomes uncluttered, their vision becomes deep, their life becomes awake. They begin to recognize the divine not only in moments of worship, but in moments of silence, in the faces of others, in the unfolding of their own story. This beatitude does not ask you to become perfect, it asks you to become true. And in becoming true, you begin to see the world as God sees it, full of meaning, full of beauty, full of divine presence waiting to be recognized. The pure heart becomes a window, and through that window, the light of God becomes visible. This is the blessing. This is the transformation. This is the revolution waiting inside every heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they are the ones who truly see.
Jesus spoke a parable that most people misunderstand completely. He said, "Whoever hears his words and does them is like a man who built his house upon a rock. When storms came, that house stood firm, but whoever hears and doesn't do them is like a fool who built upon sand, and great was the fall of that house." Most believe this means following religious rules or church attendance. Joel Goldsmith revealed the mystical truth hidden in these words. The rock isn't external obedience. The rock is consciousness itself, the foundation of spiritual awareness that cannot be shaken by any circumstance, condition, or appearance in the material world. This isn't about belief systems or positive thinking. This is about establishing your identity in the unshakable reality of divine consciousness. When you build upon this rock, nothing in the outer world can move you. Not financial collapse, not relationship breakdown, not health crises, not global chaos. The question isn't whether you believe this teaching. The question is whether you're ready to become it, to live from this rock rather than from the shifting sands of human opinion, fear, and material dependence. Everything changes when your foundation changes. What is this rock that Jesus spoke of? It's not a metaphor for good intentions or moral behavior. Joel Goldsmith taught that the rock is the realized consciousness of your true identity as spiritual being. It's the awareness that I and the Father are one, not as a statement to memorize, but as a living reality to experience. Most people build their lives on sand without knowing it. They build on education, on bank accounts, on relationships, on health, on reputation. These aren't bad things, but they're all temporary. They shift, they change, they disappear. When your sense of security rests on anything in the material realm, you're building on sand. The rock is the recognition that your life is not dependent on conditions. Your supply doesn't come from your job, it flows through it from infinite source. Your health doesn't come from your body, it expresses through it from divine wholeness. Your peace doesn't come from circumstances, it radiates from your consciousness of God's presence. This is why some people remain stable during catastrophes while others crumble during minor inconveniences. It's not about strength of personality. It's about depth of foundation, about where your consciousness is anchored in moments of testing. Joel Goldsmith experienced this rock-solid foundation during World War II. While others panicked about shortages and dangers, he maintained an inner stability that defied logic. He wasn't denying the outer appearances. He was living from a consciousness that knew his life was hidden in God, untouchable by human events. He taught that building on the rock requires daily practice of returning to this center. Every morning, before engaging with the world, you must establish your consciousness in the truth of being. You must remember that nothing in the visible world is your source, your life, or your identity. This isn't prayer as begging or bargaining. This is recognition. You're not trying to get God to do something. You're acknowledging what already is, that the kingdom of God is within you, that your being is already complete in spiritual reality, regardless of what appears in the material picture. The storms will come. They always do. Economic storms, relationship storms, health storms, global storms. The question isn't whether storms arrive. The question is what foundation you've built upon when they do. Will you stand or will you fall? Will you panic or will you remain centered in the awareness of God's presence? Here's the practice Joel Goldsmith gave for building upon the rock. Each morning, sit in silence and recognize this truth. I have no life separate from God. My life is the life of God being lived. Therefore, nothing in the human scene can threaten what I am. This isn't affirmation hoping to create something. This is recognition of what eternally is. Throughout your day, when appearances challenge you, when fear knocks at your door, when problems seem overwhelming, you return to the rock. You don't fight the appearance. You don't deny what you see. You simply return to the foundation, to the consciousness that knows your true identity is spiritual and therefore untouchable. This takes weeks and months of practice. Not because God is far away, but because your habits of material dependence are deeply ingrained. You've spent years building on sand, trusting in effects rather than cause, looking to the world for what can only come from consciousness. But every time you return to this rock, you strengthen your foundation. Every time you refuse to panic, refuse to believe the material appearance is your reality, refuse to let circumstances dictate your inner state, you're building your house upon solid ground that cannot be shaken by any storm. Let me share what happened with William, a corporate executive who lost everything in the financial crisis. His company collapsed, his investments evaporated, his reputation was destroyed. For months he lived in terror, unable to sleep, watching his world crumble. He had built his entire identity on success, on wealth, on status. Then a friend gave him Joel Goldsmith's writings about building on the rock. At first, William dismissed it as spiritual bypassing, as denial of his very real problems. But desperation made him willing to try anything. He began the practice of recognizing his life didn't depend on his circumstances. It wasn't instant transformation. For weeks, fear would overwhelm him within minutes of sitting in silence. His mind would race with financial calculations, with worst-case scenarios, with shame about what he'd lost. But he kept returning to the rock, to the recognition that his being was untouched by material conditions. Gradually, something shifted. Not his circumstances at first, but his consciousness. He began to experience moments of genuine peace despite his situation. Not peace because he found solutions, but peace that existed regardless of solutions. He was discovering the rock beneath the sand. After 3 months of this practice, William's external situation began to change, but not in the way he expected. He didn't get his old life back. Instead, opportunities emerged that he never would have pursued when he was comfortable. A small consulting opportunity led to another, then another. What amazed him wasn't the money returning, though it did. What amazed him was his complete lack of anxiety during the rebuilding process. He'd lost his business before and been terrified. Now he was starting over and felt genuinely stable. The difference wasn't his circumstances. The difference was his foundation. He told me years later that losing everything was the greatest gift of his life. Not because of what he rebuilt externally, but because it forced him to discover what couldn't be lost. He'd spent 50 years building on sand, and one financial storm had revealed the folly of that foundation. Now when economic news turns dark, when others panic about markets and recessions, William remains centered in a consciousness that knows his supply flows from infinite source, not from conditions. He built his house upon the rock, and when storms come, his house stands firm. Consider Dorothy, a woman diagnosed with a serious illness that doctors said would progressively worsen. She'd always been health conscious, exercising, eating well, taking supplements. She'd built her sense of security on maintaining a healthy body. The diagnosis shattered that foundation completely. She discovered Joel Goldsmith's teachings while searching desperately for healing methods. His message seemed paradoxical. Stop looking to the body for health. The body is effect, not cause. Health is a quality of consciousness, and consciousness is untouched by physical conditions. For months, Dorothy practiced sitting in the recognition that her true life was spiritual, that her identity wasn't a vulnerable physical form, but an expression of divine being. She didn't deny her symptoms. She simply refused to accept them as definition of what she was. The doctors were surprised when her next tests showed improvement. They were shocked when subsequent tests showed continued healing. Dorothy wasn't surprised. She'd discovered that when you build your sense of life on the rock of spiritual consciousness rather than the sand of physical conditions, the body responds to that higher foundation. What Joel Goldsmith revealed is that the body doesn't create health or disease. Consciousness does. When your consciousness rests on the rock of spiritual identity, knowing your life isn't material but divine, the body manifests that consciousness. This isn't magical thinking. This is understanding the true relationship between consciousness and form. Dorothy's healing took nearly a year of consistent practice. There were setbacks, moments of fear, times when symptoms seemed to worsen. But she'd learned to return to the rock, to recognize that her being wasn't dependent on physical conditions, and slowly her body reflected that consciousness. She didn't just heal physically. She gained something far more valuable, a foundation that circumstances cannot shake. Now, when health challenges arise, and they still do, she doesn't panic. She returns to the rock, to the consciousness that knows her life is hidden in God. If these transformation stories reveal the power of building on the rock, like this video to help others discover this foundation, subscribe for more Joel Goldsmith wisdom, and comment. Which area of your life needs a stronger foundation? Beyond the morning practice, Joel Goldsmith taught specific techniques for maintaining rock-solid consciousness throughout your day. The first is what he called impersonalization. When someone attacks you, criticizes you, or tries to manipulate you, you recognize they're not acting from their true spiritual nature but from a false sense of separation. You don't fight them or defend yourself from a place of fear. You silently recognize, this isn't the true identity of this person. This is hypnotic belief in separation speaking. I don't react to the appearance. I remain anchored in the rock, in the consciousness that knows only spiritual identity is real. This practice transforms relationships completely. Instead of being wounded by others' behavior, instead of retaliating or withdrawing in hurt, you maintain your center. You respond from consciousness rather than reacting from ego. This doesn't mean accepting abuse. It means not letting another's unconsciousness disturb your foundation. The second technique is nothingization. When problems appear, when circumstances seem threatening, you recognize their nothingness. Not that they're not happening, but that they have no power over your spiritual reality. You see them as temporary appearances with no substance in truth. Here's how nothingization works practically. You receive a threatening letter, or a disturbing diagnosis, or news of financial trouble. Your first reaction is fear because you're building on sand, on the belief that these conditions determine your reality. But then you remember the rock. You sit quietly and recognize, this appearance has no power over my spiritual being. My life is in God, and God knows nothing of lack, disease, or danger. I don't fight this appearance with worry or manipulation. I simply recognize its nothingness in the face of spiritual truth. This isn't denial or positive thinking. You're not pretending the letter doesn't exist or the diagnosis wasn't given. You're recognizing that these material appearances don't touch your true identity. You remain anchored in the rock while the storms of circumstances blow around you. Joel Goldsmith would receive news that would terrify most people and remain completely at peace. Not because he was unaware of the situation, but because he'd built his consciousness on the foundation that nothing in the material realm could threaten what he truly was. That's the freedom of building on the rock. The third technique is practicing the presence. Throughout your day, in the middle of activities and conversations, you pause for a moment and consciously recognize God's presence, not as something far away that you're trying to reach, but as the very ground of your being, closer than your breath. This isn't formal meditation requiring special time or place. It's a brief inner turning, a remembering that you live and move and have your being in God. In a business meeting, before making a phone call, while driving, while cooking dinner, you take a moment to establish your consciousness in the rock. What happens is remarkable. These brief moments of recognition accumulate throughout your day, building a foundation of awareness that circumstances cannot penetrate. You're not trying to control outcomes or manipulate conditions. You're simply maintaining conscious contact with the source of your being. Most people live entirely on the surface of life, reacting to every circumstance, blown about by every wind of change. The practice of the presence establishes you in the depths, anchored to the rock. The surface may be turbulent, but the depths remain still and strong. Joel Goldsmith taught one more critical practice: release from mental manipulation. Most people unconsciously try to use spiritual truth to control outcomes. They practice presence hoping to get something, to change circumstances, to make things happen their way. This is still building on sand. True building on the rock means releasing all attempts to use truth as a tool for personal gain. You establish your consciousness in spiritual identity not to get a better job or heal your body or improve relationships. You do it because it's true, because it's who you are, regardless of what manifests externally. This is the hardest lesson for most seekers. We want the rock to serve our sandy desires. We want spiritual consciousness to give us material success. But the rock doesn't serve the sand. The rock replaces it. You can't build on both. You must choose your foundation. When you finally release the need to control outcomes, when you rest in spiritual consciousness simply because it's your true nature, something miraculous happens. The things you were trying to force begin to unfold naturally, not because you manipulated them into being, but because consciousness aligned with truth naturally manifests harmony. Let's address the challenges honestly. The biggest obstacle to building on the rock is the habit of material dependence. You've spent your entire life believing your supply comes from your job, your health from your body, your security from conditions. These beliefs don't disappear in a weekend workshop. Christopher practiced these principles faithfully for months and saw no external change. His financial situation remained difficult. His health issues persisted. His relationships stayed strained. He began to doubt whether this rock foundation was real or just spiritual fantasy. This is where most people give up. Joel Goldsmith warned about this testing period. The old consciousness built on sand doesn't surrender easily. It fights back with evidence, with circumstances that seem to prove spiritual truth doesn't work. The storms seem to intensify just when you're trying to build on the rock. Christopher almost quit, but something inside him recognized that his peace during the difficulties had changed. He was broke before and terrified. He was broke now and somehow stable. The circumstances were the same, but his foundation was shifting. He decided to continue the practice regardless of outer results. The breakthrough came for Christopher not when his circumstances changed, but when he stopped measuring success by circumstances. He realized he'd been practicing spiritual truth with a material agenda, trying to use the rock to improve the sand. That was still building on sand. When he shifted to practicing spiritual consciousness simply because it was true, not to get anything, something fundamental changed. Within weeks, opportunities began appearing. Not because he was manipulating them with spiritual techniques, but because his consciousness was no longer blocking the natural flow of good. This is the paradox Joel Goldsmith taught. When you stop trying to use truth to change conditions, conditions change naturally. When you build on the rock without agenda, the storms lose their power to disturb your foundation, and often the storms themselves begin to calm. Another common obstacle is impatience. People practice for a few days or weeks and expect complete transformation. Building on the rock is like learning any skill. A pianist doesn't master Beethoven in a month. A foundation of spiritual consciousness isn't established in a few meditation sessions. Some face the obstacle of intellectual understanding without experiential realization. They read Joel Goldsmith's words. They comprehend the concepts. They can explain the teachings to others. But they haven't tasted the rock. They know about it but don't stand upon it. Knowledge isn't the same as consciousness. Betty could quote Goldsmith perfectly. She understood intellectually that her life was spiritual and not material. But when her husband left her unexpectedly, all that knowledge evaporated. She fell apart completely, lost in emotions, overwhelmed by fear of the future. Her house was built on the sand of intellectual understanding. It took that crisis to show her the difference between knowing about the rock and standing on it. She began practicing not just with her mind, but with her whole being. Instead of thinking about spiritual truth, she sat in silence until she felt the presence, until she knew with certainty beyond thought. This took months of daily practice, often feeling nothing, often doubting, often wondering if she was fooling herself. But gradually, something deeper than thought began to stabilize within her. Not understanding, but being. Not knowledge about the rock, but standing upon it. The final major obstacle is the fear of letting go. Building on the rock requires releasing your grip on the sandy foundations you've trusted, your education, your savings, your health regimen, your relationships. These aren't bad, but they can't be your foundation. Letting go of them as source feels terrifying. Joel Goldsmith taught that you don't have to reject or abandon anything in your life. You simply change what you depend on. The job remains, but it's no longer your source. The relationship continues, but it's no longer your security. Everything stays, but the foundation shifts from material to spiritual. This shift happens gradually as you practice. You notice one day that a problem that would have devastated you barely registers. You realize that circumstances that used to control your emotional state no longer have that power. The external life may look similar, but you're standing on different ground. If these obstacle-breaking insights resonate with your spiritual journey, like to support this content, subscribe for advanced Joel Goldsmith teachings, and comment, which challenge are you ready to transform right now? Let's explore advanced integration. Once you've established basic practice, Joel Goldsmith taught how to maintain rock-solid consciousness in extreme situations. He called this living in the fourth dimension, where you're physically present in the world, but spiritually anchored beyond it. Kenneth was a surgeon who integrated these practices into his demanding profession. Before each surgery, he would take 30 seconds to establish his consciousness in the rock. Not praying for successful outcomes, but recognizing that divine intelligence was the only presence and power operating through his hands. He noticed that surgeries went more smoothly when he maintained this consciousness. Not because he became magically more skilled, but because anxiety and self-doubt weren't interfering with his training and experience. He was operating from the rock rather than from the sand of fear and ego. In his personal life, he applied the same principle. Financial decisions, family challenges, health concerns, everything was met from the foundation of spiritual consciousness first, then practical action. He wasn't being impractical or irresponsible. He was ensuring his actions flowed from the rock rather than from fear or material dependency. Advanced practice means recognizing that building on the rock isn't separate from daily life. You're not spiritual during meditation and material the rest of the day. You maintain the inner foundation while engaging fully with outer activities. The rock becomes your natural state, not something you achieve through effort. Angela ran a business serving hundreds of clients. She couldn't spend hours in meditation. She learned to maintain rock consciousness while answering emails, leading meetings, solving problems. Brief moments of recognition throughout the day kept her anchored in spiritual awareness while handling material responsibilities. What changed wasn't her activities, but her relationship to them. Before, she was anxious about outcomes, desperate for success, terrified of failure. After establishing her foundation on the rock, she engaged fully with her business while remaining detached from results. She did her best and left outcomes to divine intelligence. Her business actually grew when she stopped being desperate about it. Clients sensed a different energy, a stability and confidence that wasn't ego-driven but consciousness-based. She wasn't trying to prove anything or protect anything. She was simply expressing from a solid foundation. Joel Goldsmith taught that the ultimate test of building on the rock comes during collective storms, when the whole world seems to be panicking, when economic collapse threatens, when global events create mass fear. Can you maintain your center? This is when your foundation is truly revealed. During the pandemic, those who had built on the rock of spiritual consciousness responded differently than those building on sand. Not that they were unwise or irresponsible, but they weren't paralyzed by fear. They took practical precautions while remaining anchored in the awareness that their life was hidden in God. Richard watched friends and colleagues fall apart emotionally despite being materially comfortable. Their sandy foundations were exposed. He noticed his own surprising stability, not because his circumstances were better, but because his consciousness was established on something circumstances couldn't touch. He'd been practicing these principles for 3 years before the crisis hit. Without that foundation, he would have been as panicked as everyone else. But those 3 years of returning to the rock, of recognizing his spiritual identity, of nothingizing material appearances, had built something in consciousness that external events couldn't shake. The advanced practitioner learns to help others find the rock without preaching at them. When someone comes in fear or desperation, you don't lecture them about spiritual truth. You simply hold the consciousness of their spiritual wholeness while they're lost in the appearance of their problem. This is what Joel Goldsmith did naturally. People would come to him with terrible circumstances, and he would listen with compassion while maintaining inner recognition that what they were describing had no power over their spiritual being. Often, without him saying much, they would leave feeling different. You become a stabilizing presence in others' storms not by giving advice or reassurance, but by standing on the rock yourself. Your consciousness of their spiritual perfection, held silently while they express their material concerns, creates a space where their own consciousness can shift. This isn't technique or manipulation. It's natural expression from a consciousness that's truly built on the rock. You don't fear their problems because you know problems have no reality in spiritual truth. Your unshakable foundation becomes an invitation for them to discover their own. Let's speak about the transformation that unfolds when the rock becomes your permanent foundation. You stop living reactively, blown about by every change in circumstances. You develop an inner stability that doesn't depend on anything external remaining the same. This is true freedom. Joel Goldsmith lived this way constantly. Students would marvel at his peace during situations that should have created stress. He wasn't superhuman or enlightened beyond struggle. He'd simply built his consciousness on the rock so consistently that returning to that foundation became automatic, instantaneous, natural. You can reach this place, not through perfection or by never having challenges, but by making the return to the rock your consistent practice. Every time circumstances disturb you, you have an opportunity to strengthen your foundation by refusing to build your reaction on sand. The transformation isn't that problems stop coming. The transformation is that problems stop defining you. You meet them from a foundation that circumstances cannot shake, and you discover that most problems dissolve when met from spiritual consciousness rather than material fear. The storms come, but your house stands firm. Building on the rock changes your entire relationship with time. You stop living in constant anxiety about the future or regret about the past. Your consciousness rests in the eternal now, where God's presence is always available, always stable, always complete. This is where the rock exists, in the timeless reality of being. Most people never experience now because their consciousness is scattered across past regrets and future fears. They're building on the sand of time, and time constantly shifts. The rock exists beyond time, in the spiritual reality that is eternally present, unchanging, always available. When you establish your consciousness in this eternal now, you still plan wisely and learn from experience. But you're not trapped in time. You're not enslaved to the ticking clock or the changing seasons. You rest in something timeless while engaging with the temporal. This is what Jesus meant when he said, "Consider the lilies of the field." They don't worry about tomorrow because they're rooted in the eternal presence that provides all things in the perfect now. When you build on the rock, you discover the same freedom from the tyranny of time. The deepest teaching Joel Goldsmith gave about the rock is this: The rock and you are not separate. You're not a person trying to stand on something external called spiritual consciousness. You are spiritual consciousness. The rock is your true identity, not something you achieve, but something you recognize. This recognition changes everything. You stop trying to become spiritual and realize you already are. You stop trying to reach God and recognize God is the very life you're living. You stop building on the rock and discover you are the rock, expressing as individual consciousness. This isn't metaphor or poetry. This is the literal truth of your being. What you call I is not a vulnerable human trying to become spiritual. What you call I is divine consciousness itself, appearing as individual expression. When you know this, really know it beyond thought, you're unshakable. All the storms of material existence cannot touch what you truly are, because what you truly are isn't material. It's spiritual, eternal, complete, and perfect. Building on the rock is recognizing this truth and living from it consistently until it becomes your natural state, until you can't be moved from this foundation. Here is your practice going forward. Each morning before engaging with the world, sit quietly and recognize, I am not a human seeking spiritual consciousness. I am spiritual consciousness itself, appearing as this individual expression. Nothing in the material world can threaten what I truly am. Throughout your day, return to this rock whenever circumstances challenge you. Don't fight the appearances. Don't deny what you see. Simply recognize that the foundation of your being is spiritual and therefore untouchable by material conditions. Let this recognition be your response to every storm. Be patient with yourself during this building process. Joel Goldsmith spent years establishing this consciousness. Some days you'll feel solid on the rock. Other days you'll find yourself back on sand. This is normal. The practice is in the returning, in the consistent choice to build your awareness on truth rather than appearance. If your spiritual understanding has expanded through these Joel Goldsmith teachings, like this video now, subscribe for more transformational wisdom, and comment I am built on the rock to confirm your commitment to this unshakable foundation.
We spend our entire lives building fortresses. Brick by brick, we construct elaborate defenses around who we think we are, what we believe we need, and what we're terrified of losing. We accumulate credentials, cultivate identities, and cling to certainties like shipwreck survivors clutching driftwood in an endless ocean. We're told this is wisdom. Protect yourself, preserve yourself, advance yourself. The entire machinery of modern life is built on this premise. Hold on tight, or you'll disappear into the void. But what if I told you that this white-knuckled grip on life is precisely what's strangling the life out of you? There's an ancient teaching that cuts through millennia of accumulated wisdom like a sword through fog. It appears in various forms across traditions, but perhaps most starkly in the words attributed to Jesus, for whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Strip away the religious context for a moment and look at the bare architecture of this statement. It's not a platitude. It's not moral instruction. It's a blueprint, a precise map for a kind of freedom most of us have never even imagined possible. This paradox isn't asking you to believe anything. It's pointing at something you can verify in your own experience, that the life you're trying so desperately to preserve is itself a prison, and the key to your cell has been in your hand all along. The key is surrender. The key is loss. The key is a kind of death that doesn't end in a grave, but opens into a space so vast that everything you thought you needed suddenly becomes irrelevant. In a world obsessed with self-optimization, personal branding, and getting ahead, this teaching sounds like madness. And maybe it is. But it's the kind of madness that built cathedrals, sparked revolutions, and occasionally transforms an ordinary human being into a force of nature. It's the madness of Mozart forgetting himself in composition, of activists facing down tanks, of lovers who would rather burn together than live apart in safety. Today, we're going to excavate this paradox. We're going to examine why your attempts to save your life are slowly killing you, what it actually means to lose your life, and how that loss becomes the strangest, most terrifying, most liberating thing you'll ever experience. The prison of self-preservation. Let's start with an uncomfortable question. What are you protecting? Seriously, pause and take inventory. What are you afraid of losing? Your reputation, your relationship status, your career trajectory, your self-image as a good person, a smart person, a successful person, your political views, your aesthetic preferences, your carefully curated social media persona. Now here's the deeper question. How much of your life energy, your actual finite days on this planet, goes into maintaining and defending these things? For most of us, the answer is staggering. We are endlessly preoccupied with preservation. We monitor how we're perceived. We manage our image. We position ourselves strategically in social and professional hierarchies. We avoid risks that might damage our standing. We say things we don't mean to maintain relationships. We hide our true thoughts to preserve the peace. We pursue careers we don't care about because they're stable. We stay in situations that drain us because leaving would mean admitting we made a mistake and we can't afford that hit to our self-concept. This is the prison. It doesn't have bars. It's made of something far more insidious, your own desperate need for continuity, security, and validation. The Buddhist tradition has a term for this, tanha, often translated as craving or thirst. But it's more specific than that. It's the thirst for existence, for becoming, for ensuring that you continue in a particular form. It's the project of self-preservation that occupies every waking moment, even when you're not conscious of it. And here's what makes it truly insidious. This project can never be completed. There is no amount of money, status, love, or achievement that will finally make you secure. Because the threat isn't outside. The threat is existence itself, the fundamental instability of everything, including you. You are not a fixed thing. You're a process. A flowing river that your mind keeps trying to freeze into a sculpture, and the effort of freezing it is exhausting. Consider the modern workplace. How many people do you know who are genuinely free in their careers, not just financially comfortable, but actually free? Most people live in a state of constant defensive maneuvering. They can't say what they really think. They can't take the creative risks they want to take. They certainly can't fail, not really, not publicly, not in ways that might damage their professional brand. So they play it safe, and that safety becomes a cage so familiar they stop noticing it's a cage at all. Or consider relationships. How many relationships are sustained not by genuine connection, but by fear of loss? People stay in mediocre marriages because divorce would be admitting failure. They maintain friendships that have long since gone stale because ending them would be awkward. They can't be honest with their partners about their needs because that honesty might threaten the relationship, and then where would they be? The irony is beautiful and terrible in trying to save your life, your security, your image, your sense of who you are. You lose access to life itself. You become so busy defending the fortress that you forget to actually live inside it. The preservation project consumes everything it's meant to preserve. Fear is the engine of this whole mechanism. Not the clean, immediate fear of a predator or a car accident, but the chronic humming anxiety that permeates everything. The fear of being rejected, being exposed, being inadequate, being alone, being nobody. This fear dictates your choices so completely that you no longer recognize you're making choices at all. The prison becomes invisible because you've internalized it so thoroughly. And the cruelest part? The thing you're trying to preserve, this self you're protecting, is largely a fiction. It's a story you tell yourself, cobbled together from memories, social feedback, and sheer imagination. You think you're defending something real and solid, but you're actually defending a ghost. You're dedicating your entire life to preserving something that never existed in the first place. This is the prison, and you're both the prisoner and the jailer. What losing your life actually means. Before we go further, let's clear up what this teaching is not advocating. It's not advocating suicide. It's not promoting martyrdom or pointless self-sacrifice. It's not asking you to become a doormat or abandon all boundaries. It's not suggesting you should neglect your responsibilities or live recklessly. And it's definitely not nihilism, some grim resignation that nothing matters, so you might as well give up. The death being pointed to here is psychological and spiritual, not physical. It's the death of the false self, the constructed identity you've been defending. It's the dissolution of the ego's stranglehold on your existence. Think of it this way: you have a face you show the world. You have beliefs about who you are, your personality traits, your values, your history, your role in various social contexts. You have ambitions, fears, and a whole narrative about your life. This is the ego, not some evil part of you, but simply the organized sense of separate selfhood. Now, this ego serves a function. It helps you navigate the world, remember your name, show up to appointments. But somewhere along the way, you made a catastrophic error. You identified completely with this construction. You came to believe that this organized sense of self, I's you, and that if it were threatened or dissolved, you would cease to exist. Losing your life means discovering, experientially, that this identification is false. It means allowing the constructed self to die, not through violence or suppression, but through a kind of radical transparency and letting go. Imagine you're clenching your fist as hard as you can for hours, for years your hand cramps. It aches. The tension becomes so constant you forget what it feels like to relax. Someone tells you, open your hand, and you're terrified. You've been holding on for so long that you've forgotten what you're even holding. The grip itself has become your identity. Opening your hand feels like it would mean losing yourself. But then you do it. You open your hand, and nothing terrible happens. In fact, the relief is so profound you could weep. You realize the thing you were holding was nothing, empty air, and the thing you were protecting by holding so tight was just the habit of holding. This is what losing your life looks like. It's the opening of the fist. It's the relaxation of the death grip you have on your identity, your plans, your need to control how you're perceived and what happens to you. In practical terms, it might look like letting go of the career you spent a decade building because you finally admit you hate it. It might look like ending a relationship you've been clinging to out of fear of being alone. It might look like saying the thing everyone expects you not to say, and letting the chips fall where they may. It might look like pursuing the creative project you're afraid to pursue because failing at it would hurt too much. It might look like facing the truth about yourself, something you've been hiding even from yourself, and living with that truth regardless of the consequences. It's the death of the curated self, the death of the defended position, the death of the project of making yourself invulnerable. And here's the secret: you can't do this strategically. You can't lose your life as a tactic to gain something better. That would just be another preservation strategy, another ego move. The loss has to be genuine. It has to be a real surrender, not a calculated investment. This is why the teaching is so radical. It's asking you to leap without knowing where you'll land. It's asking you to die without a guarantee of resurrection. And that's precisely why it works. The mechanics of freedom through surrender. So what actually happens when you lose your life in this way? How does surrender create freedom? The mechanism is surprisingly straightforward, even if the experience is profound. When you're identified with the ego, with the project of self-preservation, your entire experience of reality is filtered through one question: how does this affect me? Every situation, every interaction, every piece of information is immediately processed in terms of whether it helps or hinders the self-project. Does this make me look good? Does this threaten my security? Is this person an ally or a competitor? Can I use this to advance my position? This creates a peculiar kind of blindness. You can't see reality as it is because you're only seeing your own projections, your own needs, your own defenses. The world becomes a mirror, endlessly reflecting your own face back at you, and that's a very small world. When you let go, when you genuinely lose your life, something shifts. Without the constant need to manage and defend the self, perception opens up. You can finally see what's actually in front of you. rather than seeing only how things relate to your survival project. This is where real freedom begins. You become capable of action that isn't driven by fear or the need for validation. You can speak truthfully because you're no longer protecting an image. You can take risks because you're not defending a position. You can fail spectacularly because you've already died. What's left to lose? Look at the lives of people who've undergone this kind of ego death. I'm not talking about saints or mystics exclusively, though they're included. I'm talking about anyone who's had their identity shattered and somehow survived. Consider someone who's lost everything, a business failure that wipes them out, a scandal that destroys their reputation, a diagnosis that upends their future. In the immediate aftermath, there's devastation. But talk to these people years later, and many will tell you the same strange story. Losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to them. Why? Because it broke the spell. The thing they thought they couldn't survive, they survived. The identity they thought was essential, it turned out not to be. And in the rubble of that false self, they found something more real, a capacity for authenticity, for risk, for genuine relationship, for joy that isn't dependent on circumstances. Or consider artists who create their best work only after they stop trying to create successful work. The moment they stop performing for an audience, stop trying to defend a reputation or build a brand, something authentic can finally emerge. They've lost their artistic life, their concern with reception and criticism, and in doing so found actual creative freedom. The same pattern appears everywhere. The activist who stops caring about their safety and becomes unstoppable. The lover who stops trying to make the relationship work and either leaves or suddenly finds real intimacy. The spiritual seeker who gives up the search and discovers what they were seeking was always present. There's a psychological dimension to this that's worth examining. When you're not defending an ego position, several things happen simultaneously. First, you stop being reactive. Most of our behavior is driven by unconscious reactivity, defending against perceived threats to our self-image. When that mechanism relaxes, you gain access to a kind of responsive intelligence that's been unavailable. You can actually think clearly because you're not in constant defensive mode. Second, you become transparent. Deception of yourself and others requires enormous energy. It requires tracking multiple narratives, managing information, maintaining facades. When you drop this, the energy becomes available for other things. Life becomes simpler, lighter. Third, you gain access to the present moment. The self-preservation project is always oriented toward the future or ruminating about the past. When you let go of it, you can actually be here now. And here now turns out to be the only place where life actually happens. Fourth, paradoxically, you become more powerful, not in a dominating way, but in terms of genuine effectiveness. When you're not paralyzed by the fear of loss, you can move decisively. When you're not protecting an image, you can admit mistakes quickly and correct course. When you're not clinging to outcomes, you can take bigger risks. This is the freedom the paradox points to. It's not the freedom to do whatever you want. That's just another form of ego gratification. It's the freedom from the tyranny of your own mind, from the constant fear-driven strategizing that masquerades as living. And here's the beautiful part. This freedom is contagious. People sense it. When you're in the presence of someone who's genuinely free, who's lost their life in this way, something in you recognizes it. It's magnetic. Not because they're performing freedom or demonstrating it, but because the absence of defensive positioning creates space for real connection. Practical applications. This all sounds very profound, but what does it actually look like in the mundane terrain of everyday life? How do you lose your life when you have rent to pay, relationships to maintain, and 1,000 daily responsibilities? Let's get concrete. In career and ambition, the conventional approach to career is essentially a preservation strategy. You build a resume, develop a professional brand, network. Strategically, avoid failures that might damage your trajectory. You make choices based on what looks good, what provides security, what moves you up the ladder. Losing your life in this domain means making choices based on what's actually alive for you, regardless of how they look. It might mean leaving a prestigious position for something more meaningful but less impressive on paper. It might mean pursuing a creative project that has no clear monetization path. It might mean admitting you're in the wrong field entirely, even after years of investment. The freedom that emerges is the freedom to do work that matters to you, to take creative risks, to fail publicly and learn from it. You stop performing your career and start living it. A practical example: I know someone who spent 15 years building a successful law practice, becoming a partner, checking all the boxes. Then at 45, he admitted to himself that he hated it. He'd been defending his choice, the sunk cost, the image of success, the expectations, rather than admitting the truth. When he finally let that identity die, he walked away, started teaching, made a fraction of the money, and for the first time in decades, felt alive. His marriage improved because he wasn't constantly bitter and defended. His creativity returned. He lost his professional life and found an actual life. In relationships, we enter relationships with so much agenda. We need them to validate us, complete us, provide security, reflect well on us. We perform versions of ourselves we think will be acceptable. We hide our needs, suppress our truths, manage our partner's perception of us. Losing your life in relationship means showing up without armor. It means saying the things you're afraid to say. It means being willing to lose the relationship rather than continue performing in it. Paradoxically, this often saves relationships or ends ones that needed to end. The freedom here is the freedom to be known, to have real intimacy rather than strategic connection, to love without the constant fear of loss that turns love into a hostage situation. Practically, you stop trying to be the perfect partner and start being the actual you. You risk saying this isn't working for me even if it might trigger conflict. You let go of the fantasy relationship you're clinging to and either find something real with this person or find the courage to leave. You stop managing impressions and start having actual conversations. In creative work, most people never create the thing they really want to create because they're terrified of judgment. They produce safe work, derivative work, work that fits existing categories and expectations. The preservation strategy here is avoiding the vulnerability of being truly seen. Losing your life as a creator means making the work you're afraid to make. It means putting it out even if it's imperfect, even if it might be criticized, even if it exposes something raw about you. It means letting go of outcomes, whether it succeeds, whether it's appreciated, whether it advances your career. The freedom is the freedom to create from the inside out rather than the outside in. To make what's alive in you rather than what you think will work. Practically, you stop asking, will this be successful? And start asking, is this true? You share your work before it's perfect. You let go of the outcome. You make things that might be terrible because that's the only way to eventually make things that are great. In facing mortality, ultimately, this paradox is about death. Not metaphorical death, but the actual, inevitable end of your physical existence. Our entire ego project is built on denying this reality. We live as if we have infinite time, as if death is something that happens to other people. Losing your life means facing your mortality directly, not morbidly, but honestly. It means recognizing that this moment, this day, this conversation might be one of your last. That puts everything in perspective very quickly. The freedom is the freedom to stop postponing your life, to stop waiting for perfect conditions, to stop preserving yourself for some future that might never arrive. Practically, you start doing the things you're waiting to do. You have the conversations you're waiting to have. You take the risks you're waiting to take. You live as if you're going to die because you are. The obstacles and dark night. Let's be honest, if this were easy, everyone would do it. The reason most people never lose their life in this way is because it's genuinely terrifying. The obstacles are both external and internal, and they're formidable. Externally, society is set up to reward preservation strategies. The entire system of credentials, status hierarchies, professional advancement, it all depends on people playing the game. When you opt out, there are real consequences people might not understand. Opportunities might disappear. You might lose social standing, financial security, or relationships that were contingent on you remaining who they thought you were. But the external obstacles, while real, aren't the deepest challenge. The deeper obstacles are internal. The first obstacle is that your ego will fight back. The self-preservation mechanism is ancient, powerful, and cunning. As you start to let go, you'll experience tremendous resistance. This might show up as anxiety, as sabotaging behaviors, as sudden practical concerns that pull you back from the edge. Your mind will generate 1,000 reasons why now isn't the right time, why you need to wait, why you need more security before you can surrender. The second obstacle is that genuine surrender feels like death because, in a sense, it is. You're allowing a version of yourself to cease existing. Even knowing intellectually that something better might emerge doesn't make the immediate experience less terrifying. You can't see the other side from here. You have to jump blind. The third obstacle is distinguishing genuine surrender from its counterfeits. There's a version of losing your life that's actually just escapism, running away from responsibility, using spiritual language to justify avoidance. This isn't freedom, it's just a different form of self-preservation, protecting yourself from the discomfort of engagement. There's a version that's actually narcissism, making a dramatic show of not caring, of being above it all, of having transcended. This is the ego pretending to be egoless, which is perhaps the sneakiest ego move of all. There's a version that's self-destruction, driven by self-hatred, rather than genuine surrender. This leads to harm, not liberation. Discernment here is crucial and difficult. Generally, genuine surrender has certain markers. It increases your capacity for love and authentic action rather than decreasing it. It makes you more present and responsive, not less. It might involve loss and grief, but not bitterness. It opens doors even as it closes others. Then there's what the mystics call the dark night of the soul, the period after you've let go but before anything new has emerged. You've lost your life, but you haven't yet found it. You're in the void, the liminal space, and it's deeply uncomfortable. In this phase, everything you used to care about might seem meaningless. Your old life doesn't work anymore, but a new life hasn't appeared. You might feel lost, depressed, disconnected. People around you might think you're having a breakdown. And in a sense you are, but it's a breakthrough disguised as a breakdown. The dark night is where most people turn back. They can't tolerate the groundlessness, the lack of structure, the absence of the familiar self, so they rebuild the ego, perhaps in a slightly different form, and go back to the preservation project. They've touched freedom but couldn't stay with it. The invitation during the dark night is simply to endure, to not grasp for premature resolution, to trust the process even, when the process feels like disintegration. This is faith, not in a religious sense necessarily, but in the sense of continuing forward without certainty. What emerges on the other side, if you can stay with it, is not a new improved ego, but something altogether different. It's what the teaching promises. You find your life, but it's not the life you were trying to save. It's something you couldn't have imagined from the old perspective, finding life on the other side. So what is this life you find after losing your life? It's not what you expect. It's not a permanent state of bliss or a final arrival point. It's not invulnerability or enlightenment in some grand sense. It's both more subtle and more radical than that. What emerges is a fundamental reorientation. You're still you. You still have preferences, personality traits, challenges. But the center of gravity has shifted. You're no longer organized around the protection and advancement of the ego. You're open. This openness manifests in specific ways. You become capable of genuine joy, Not the kind that depends on circumstances aligning, but a basic contentment with existence itself. Even difficult moments have a kind of aliveness to them. You're not numbing yourself anymore, not dividing experience into what you'll accept and what you'll resist. You're available to all of it. You develop what might be called spontaneous integrity. You don't have to think about doing the right thing or being authentic. It happens naturally because you're not protecting anything. There's no gap between what you think, what you say, and what you do. This isn't because you're morally superior, but because the mechanism that creates inauthenticity has dissolved. You experience a profound lightness. The weight of self-preservation, of constantly monitoring, managing, and defending yourself is enormous, even though you don't notice it until it lifts. Without it, there's an ease to existence. Things that used to feel heavy feel simple. Problems still arise, but they don't have the same existential charge. You gain access to real creativity. When you're not worried about outcomes, not protecting a position, not trying to prove something, creativity flows. Ideas emerge not from strain, but from receptivity. Work becomes play in the deepest sense. Serious, consequential, but not burdened. Your relationships transform. When you're not performing, not defending, not needing others to complete you or validate you, you can actually meet people. Real intimacy becomes possible. Love becomes simpler, less dramatic perhaps, but more profound. You can be alone without being lonely and connected without being dependent. You discover a kind of courage you didn't know you had. It's not the courage of gritting your teeth and forcing yourself forward. It's the courage that comes from having already died. What's left to fear? The worst already happened. You lost your life, and you're still here. This makes you simultaneously more cautious. You're not proving anything, and more bold. You're not protecting anything. Perhaps most importantly, you become useful. Not in the sense of being exploited, but in the sense of being able to serve something larger than your own self-project. When you're not constantly preoccupied with your own survival and advancement, energy becomes available for actual contribution. You can show up for others without martyring yourself because there's no self being martyred. This is what living without armor looks like. You're vulnerable, yes, genuinely vulnerable, not performing vulnerability. Things can hurt you, you can fail, you can be rejected, but none of it has the power it used to have because you're not defending an identity anymore. You're just here, living, responding, moving through the world. It's important to say that this isn't a permanent achievement. The ego doesn't die once and stay dead. It reasserts itself. You find yourself identified again, defended again, preserved again. But now you know the taste of freedom. You know what's possible. So you can catch yourself, open your fist again, die again. It becomes a practice, not a destination. A constant return to surrender, to loss, to letting go. But each time it gets easier. Each time the life you find gets richer, stranger, more surprising. This is what the paradox promises. Lose your life, and you'll find it. Not the life you were clinging to. That life was always too small, always cramped, always defended. But something bigger than you imagined. Something that was waiting all along, just on the other side of your fear. So here we are, at the end of this exploration, which is really just the beginning. We've examined how your self-preservation project, your desperate grip on identity, security, and control creates the very prison you're trying to escape. We've seen that the ego, while necessary, becomes tyrannical when you identify with it completely. We've explored what it actually means to lose your life, not physical death, but the dissolution of false identity and the surrender of the defended position. We've looked at how this loss paradoxically creates freedom. Freedom to see clearly, act authentically, risk boldly, and connect genuinely. We've gotten practical about what this looks like in career, relationships, creativity, and facing mortality. We've acknowledged the obstacles, the dark night, and the genuine terror of letting go. And we've glimpsed what emerges on the other side, not invulnerability, but a profound openness. Not permanent bliss, but a fundamental lightness. Not the elimination of challenges, but the capacity to meet them without the constant weight of self-protection. The teaching, "He who loses his life shall find it," isn't a religious commandment or a moral imperative. It's a description of how freedom actually works. It's a map that's been tested by mystics, artists, activists, and ordinary people throughout history who've discovered that the only way out is through the death of who you think you are into the discovery of what you actually are. But here's the thing, you can't think your way into this. You can't strategize it. You can't read about it and call that enough. At some point, you have to actually jump. You have to let something die, some identity, some security, some carefully constructed facade, and see what happens. Maybe it starts small. Maybe you say the thing you're afraid to say. Maybe you pursue the project you're terrified to pursue. Maybe you admit the truth you've been hiding. Maybe you let go of the relationship you've been clinging to. Maybe you walk away from the career that's killing you. Or maybe it comes all at once. A crisis, a loss, a shattering that you didn't choose. If that happens, remember this. The thing that feels like the end might actually be the beginning. The life you're losing might not be your life at all, but a prison you mistook for a home. The invitation is simply this. Notice where you're holding on. Notice what you're defending. Notice the tremendous energy you're expending to maintain your fortress. And then, just for a moment, consider the possibility that you could let go, that you could open your fist, that you could die to who you've been and discover who you actually are. It won't be comfortable, it won't be safe, but it might be the first genuinely free thing you've ever done. The paradox stands, stark and strange and available. Lose your life and you'll find it. The prison gate has always been unlocked. You were just holding it shut from the inside. What are you waiting for?